how exactly can you figure out your attachment style now that you're an adult?
Great question. So, part of it is definitely understanding some of the childhood context, but then it really goes into the biggest body of work that we developed on top of traditional attachment theory was about our core wounds. So, each attachment style has very specific core wounds. They also have very specific needs,
Hmm.
and they have very specific issues with boundaries and how they communicate. So, we can
Ooh,
kind of unpack
let's
those
do
things.
it.
So, securely attached people, I mean, they tend to communicate healthily. They don't really have many core wounds that are specific to relationships. They can have insecurities because they're human beings, but we won't see too much of that as a whole. They tend to have healthy boundaries. They want to resolve things right away.
Is anybody securely attached? I was laughing as I was kind of preparing to talk to you because as I was looking at the definition of secure attachment, I thought, oh, is this sort of like you thinking you're a good driver? 90% of us think we're great drivers, but we're really not great drivers. Do most people think they're securely
It's
attached?
actually very interesting. So, traditional research will show about 50% of people are securely attached.
That many?
51% is the actual number, yes.
How
I
is that
I
possible?
completely disagree. In my practice, what I saw over and over again is people would come in, they first session, I would take them through some of this stuff and they'd be like, "Oh, I'm the secure one." And then by session 2, I was like, "There's no way that they're secure." They and I think that people when we self-report, things are skewed, right? And those numbers, that 51% is based on self-reporting. Obviously, I have a biased sample size of people because they're people who are going through struggles and are reaching out for help and support. But I just found so many times that like more than half the time people would say I'm secure and then definitely not secure.
I'm kind of making a joke about it, but as a parent, right? And having three kids, 24, 23, and 18, as I'm listening to you describe the four different attachment styles, I was listening both as a parent thinking, oh, shit. Like I really probably created the anxious, preoccupied
Interesting.
attachment style by working a lot. The second you said daycare, I thought, oh gosh, that explains it. Our two daughters were in daycare. There you go. You really blew it. And then of course I'm listening for myself. And what was interesting is that I always presumed that I was probably anxious, preoccupied.
Interesting.
But as we have this conversation and I
Fearful
am
avoidant.
listening in real time, I'm wondering if I'm going to see that I'm more in the
Fearful avoidant.
fearful, I can't
Probably.
even say it. I'm so nervous
Fearful
about
avoidant.
fearful avoidant. When you said a chaotic environment, including narcissistic behavior,
Yeah.
I was like, ding, 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 ding,
Yes.
ding, ding. And when I go ding, 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 you know it means I'm leaning in. And I know that you, as you're listening, are leaning in too. And so let's go even deeper into this concept of core wounds. What are the core wounds of the three insecure attachment styles?
When we get into the insecure attachment styles, this is where we can really see the nuances that haven't been developed before. So, anxious attachment styles, their biggest core wounds are I will be abandoned, I will be alone, I will be excluded, disliked, rejected, not good enough, and unsafe. And what we'll see is they tend to feel this big trigger of unsafety when people pull away because in childhood, we're very reliant on our caregivers. So we cannot survive without them. And so what happens is as children, the anxious attachment style, when their caregivers pull away, they actually have a trauma response. Like, will I survive without them, as they're gone? And so we really easily confuse and intertwine survival with approval as anxious attachment styles. And that becomes really prevalent in childhood. And as adults, the anxious attachment style, they'll have a full nervous system reaction when somebody pulls away. That abandonment will really trigger also this deep feeling of being unsafe.
I'm just sitting here selfishly processing and thinking about my family, my relationships, as I'm sure as you're listening, you're doing the exact same thing. There's no doubt in my mind that our daughter, Kendall, has anxious attachment style because I often say, I feel like you're human blankie.
Yes.
And if she has a situation that is anything that would make her nervous or anything that would make her slightly uncertain,
Yes.
there's a phone call.
Yes.
And you know that the attachment style is kicked in because then there's a second one, and then there might be a third one.
Yes.
And is that sort of a classic indication that you feel this sense when you can't get a hold of somebody this alarm bell goes off inside you and you're firing off the text or you're calling them again or you're checking their location. Is that a good example of the type of behavior
Yes.
that somebody with anxious attachment?
Absolutely. And so what you'll see is that these core wounds, if you sort of were to trail them across, you'd see that core wounds, when we feel like I'm abandoned, we start thinking thoughts about they're never going to come back, or what if I can't get my needs met? And then this sparks emotions. And then we'll feel those emotions. And neuroscience has actually proven that every single decision we make is based on our emotions. So then these actions happen at a subconscious level where the anxious preoccupied will cling. And part of what's happening is they're terrified of losing proximity to people. And they also, as children, didn't ever learn to self soothe
Hmm.
consistently enough. So they really rely on other people to soothe. And when they can't soothe through other people, it will create problems in terms of their ability to regulate. And so some other things you'll see beyond core wounds is the needs anxious preoccupieds tend to have is they need a lot of validation, reassurance, consistency, certainty is a huge one, especially in their romantic relationships. And one of their big love languages is around physical touch. They want to be close, they want to be
Hmm.
nearby. You'll see a lot of those sorts of patterns. Anxious preoccupied attachment styles are the sweetest. They are so kind. They're so thoughtful. They really think about people. They really spend a lot of time focused on the people around them. And so, some of the superpowers of the anxious attachment style is that they're very loving. They're very warm. They're very kind. They're thoughtful. They're supportive. They really go out of their way to think about the people in their lives. So, they have all these beautiful characteristics they bring to relationships. But because their subconscious comfort zone is to be so focused on other people, the primary casualty in that relationship becomes the relationship to themselves.
Mm.
And so they will constantly deprioritize themselves, put their needs last, not speak up for their needs because they get into people pleasing behaviors. And actually, all of those things that they're doing are the crux of why it's so difficult to self soothe. Because if you don't know your needs, you can't meet your own needs, and you have all these core wounds, it becomes so difficult to self soothe. And they'll constantly try to maintain that closeness and soothe through others. But when other people are not available, that's where it becomes really tricky.
When it comes to trying to change your behavior or trying to achieve something or trying to achieve a goal, how does having this anxious attachment style and the core wound of abandonment show up in terms of sabotaging your ability to either be consistent or to do the work to change
In,
yourself?
in so many ways. So one of the biggest things is like, let's say it's something in your workplace.
Yep.
Anxious attachment styles in the workplace, they'll often put themselves last. They'll put themselves on the back burner. They'll take on other people's work and not set healthy boundaries. And all of a sudden, they're behind on their things because they're people pleasing others.
Hmm.
And also, if they have this huge fear of abandonment, what happens is we abandon ourselves, right? Whatever our core wounds are also become the biggest things we reenact in the relationship to self because the subconscious mind wants to maintain its comfort zone. So if you see somebody with an abandonment core wound, they're so worried about getting abandoned by others that they will abandon themselves to please others. And that's actually how the wound stays alive. Like if we ask ourselves, hey, those wounds came from childhood 30 years ago. How are they still alive in me now? Oh, because I am reenacting them in relationship to self through repetition and emotion on a daily basis. And if I wasn't doing that, they actually wouldn't still be here. It's not possible. So that's how the subconscious keeps these things. And so what the anxious preoccupied has to do is learn to meet their own needs, reprogram their subconscious core wounds, and then be able to actually consider themselves equally to others. Like take their own boundaries into consideration as much as they do with others. And those things become a huge part of the healing process. And we can talk about subconscious reprogramming in a little bit perhaps, but those tend to be some really important things to recognize in terms of the patterning. And then the very last thing I'll say is just anxious attachment styles as well. If they have a goal
Yes.
and then it's not even in the workplace, it's a personal goal.
Yes.
And then their friends say, but I need you. Or then they, want to make social plans or commitments. They'll be so preoccupied with that that they struggle to actually balance the other areas of their life. They'll be so focused on relationships, career can be on the back burner, finances, mental growth, emotional growth, spirituality, all those things can kind of take less precedence, which of course they'll feel later over time because they're always deprioritizing the self.
That makes so much sense.
Yeah.
If you look at the anxious attachment style from a standpoint of needs, what are their core needs?
Yes, the biggest needs that they have, and interestingly enough, these have to be the needs that they give to themselves. This is part of how they
Okay.
heal through repetition and emotion of giving these needs. So the big needs are reassurance, validation, encouragement, support, to be seen, to be heard are really, really big. People who being present with them, and then really that certainty and consistency. Like those are the big ones. And I think once we discover that, The real like discussion has to become, well, if for any number of reasons I didn't get access to that as a child, part of healing is to repetitively give that to myself now because I'm leveraging principles of neuroplasticity. Same thing, repetition and emotion that fire and wire neural pathways. And if I'm leveraging those principles, then by giving those things to myself,
Yep.
not only do I learn to self-soothe, but also because if I have those needs met, the bucket's halfway full, right? So I'm not panicked without somebody else meeting them. I'm actually soothing myself. I'm able to get there. And then it also heals and undoes the past because we're changing the programming at the subconscious level.
I want to ask you one scenario.
Yes.
So let's go back to the example of somebody who's anxiously attached
Yes.
and they say to themselves, all right, I'm not going to bother my significant other at work today. And then they find themselves getting that wave of emotion and wanting to send 15 texts. What do you do in that moment if the solution to reprogramming your subconscious is to give yourself what you need? What would you do as you're standing there with the phone?
Yes, amazing question. So there's ways to reprogram that are proactive so that we can actually recondition those wounds to begin with so they stop coming back. That's the real crux of everything. But in the moment, until we've done the reprogramming, which takes about 21 days, what we want to be able to do is make sure that we are in a position where whatever it is that we are needing from that person, we want to isolate. So if you're needing from your significant other, like what are you reaching out for? What are you hoping to get as the result? Are you needing encouragement? Are you needing certainty? And if you can look at that and realize, hey, I as a human being have the capacity to give that to myself, you can literally think of, if I could paint a picture of what that encouragement would look like from my spouse or from my friend or whoever it is, how can I give that to myself inwardly? And what's really interesting is the subconscious mind really wants a comfort zone. So it doesn't like unfamiliarity because ultimately the subconscious is survival wired, which means anything unfamiliar, it tends to reject. It's part of why we end up in the same types of relationship patterns or the same types of situations so often. So what happens is originally when an anxious preoccupied tries to give the need that they would want from others to themselves instead, like if I want to encourage myself, let me write out 3 of my wins, or let me journal about why I will be okay. Or if I need certainty, let me schedule out what I'm needing or create structure in my life. At first, it feels a little bit foreign. This is always like the thing for anxious preoccupieds. They have the hardest time meeting the needs themselves, more so than the other insecure attachment styles. But as we start doing it repetitively, we start creating these neural pathways where it becomes more comfortable. So basically what happens is over time, through the repetition and emotion of building that into our comfort zone, we usually have to essentially use our conscious mind to recondition our subconscious mind. So at first, it's more like mechanical for the first little bit. It definitely helps to soothe in that moment, but it won't feel as soothing as what an anxious preoccupied is seeking from somebody else.
Gotcha.
But by about day 7 of doing this behavior repetitively, we start to build a subconscious comfort zone around it. And by day 21, I mean, I have seen at this point thousands of people who are like anxious, preoccupied, really afraid to even be alone and spend time alone, who now come and say, oh, I actually love spending time alone. I feel comfortable with myself. I've built this relationship to myself. I don't panic anymore when my partner's not available. So this is something that's very feasible. It just takes that really first 7 days of commitment to start feeling comfortable within it. And by day 21, we see a tremendous difference.
I walked into this conversation thinking that my attachment style was one thing, and it turns out it's something completely different.